As everyone knows, we're in the infancy of this wonderful museum. These are the early events that we're having. I'll always remember tonight, the first time we had people in the stairs. And I think those of us who thought about this museum and this problem in our city for so long can't help but note the wonderful fact that we're gathering in a place that people might have avoided thinking about slavery to talk about slavery. So I believe progress is being made. And tonight, I'm going to grill my friends. Basically, it's going to be the strategy that we're talking here. I'm guessing that I'll find some way to slide in a comment here and there. But the situation is that this is the 400th anniversary of something. Historians are, if you imagine if we found a way to disagree. Right? And so I thought maybe we could talk about it, if that's okay. I'm just surprised my friends with all this. What could possibly be at issue as we're thinking about 1619?
Well, you have a lot of historians, especially from Florida, who are arguing that there were black people in Florida long before 1619. Well, really, nobody is arguing that. But Florida did not become a part of the United States until 1819.
Almost exactly
200 years later. And so there is something important about 1619, because a month before the forced arrival of two ships of people who were kidnapped, they were free people, and their towns and their cities were raided, and they were forced into bondage. And I say into bondage because these people had been free. They weren't captives in a war situation. They were minding their own businesses in their homes, and suddenly mercenaries as well as Portuguese army officials came in and seized them and kidnapped them, forced them to walk hundreds of miles to the Luanda port in what we call Angola today. And they were placed aboard, there were 350, and they were placed aboard the ship, a Spanish vessel, and sent to the Veracruz port. They had not yet arrived at that port where they would have been enslaved. And so while this sounds very nuanced, this messy period that we're talking about is important for us to know, because if we simply say, well, they were enslaved, then it's an easy story. Then it's accepting the fact, oh yeah, well, that's why they were treated poorly. That's why they were treated unequally. No, they were not enslaved people. And when they were kidnapped a second time off the coast of Veracruz by two privateers, nice words for pirate ships, one owned by the Virginia Company of London, they set those two ships, the White Lion and the Treasure, set sail for the Virginia shores. Now, Virginia, I know there's this big also debate about, oh, Jamestown versus Virginia. It is the same thing. Jamestown today, in our 21st century understanding, is a specific localized city. But Jamestown in 1619 was a colony. And in 1619, the name was changing to Virginia, so the words were used simultaneously. And the Virginia Company of London, that was in part based in Bermuda, wanted this colony. It had gotten to the point that the colony was stable enough that they said now they need to have a governmental system, that they would make and interpret their own laws. And that's where this limited legislative body was created, was founded right there at the fort. And by the way, what we call Jamestown today was called the fort at that time, or the city at that time, or the town, depending on who was writing. And so this limited body that we later, years later, we call the House of Burgesses, was the one that was founded, and they would eventually be the ones to interpret their law and not apply it to African people
From the perspective of religious studies, one of the things that we're interested in, and one of the things that our disciplinary orientation seeks to answer is this question about origins. In particular, how narratives, mythology, plays a role in helping people understand their origins, and from that origin story, I think what extends from that is a broader understanding about how society is shaped and one's role in society, whether individually or collective groups. One of the things that's at stake in the question about 1619 is 1619 versus what other alternative. Typically, when we think about the founding narratives or founding mythologies of American society, the years that we turn to are 1776, right, which ignores, 150 some odd years of history that shapes what becomes the nation state, right? And so the nation state, the customs, the laws, even as Dr.
Cassandra.
Thank you. As Cassandra mentions, the laws are birthed out of a pre-existing set of circumstances and a culture that develops. So as I think about the significance of 1619, it's thinking about what does going back to this point of origin allow us to now examine or see about the origins of American culture, right? And this cultural sort of milieu that gives birth to what becomes codified injustice, right? It begins in a particular place, and I think beginning that narrative in 1776 erases a lot of the prehistory that helps us to understand why American society develops the way it does in terms of both racial, ethnic, and economic development, and also explaining how we arrived at our contemporary moment. So I think 1619, to pull the camera back, to use your expression, I think gives us a much broader view and allows us to include some data that typically is left out when we talk about the origins of the American story.
And to pull the camera back even farther, you realize just how insignificant Virginia was, what a backwater were, that enslaved people had been brought here by pirates, while really only 6% of the people brought from Africa to the New World came to what's now the United States. And that it takes a long time, but the fact that there were people of African ancestry in Florida 100 years earlier gives you some idea that Virginia is not inventing this system of slavery, but it has to adapt it to this new environment. So words, Negro, mulatto, a lot of the words that associate with slavery are adapted from the Spanish. But there's no plan to get from 1619 to 1776. Matter of fact, there's not even a plan to get from 1619 to 1620, is it?
No.
Right. So you're talking about that. Well, I think it was the beginning of representative democracy and the beginning of African slavery, the terminus in Virginia. What was this conversation Alphonso was talking about, I think of 1776? Was there tension between this vision of representative democracy and holding other people in perpetual bondage?
Even whites weren't just indentured servants. You had whites who signed a contract that made them indentured servants. You had whites who were kidnapped that made them servants. You had whites who willingly came over but didn't sign a contract. They were servants. And then you had blacks who were coming over who were simply called servants as well. But it was clear from the beginning with the way that they were referenced. There were no names for the most part that were referenced in the arrival papers. There were no arrival papers, really. There was just a reference.
20 and odd.
20 and odd. And he didn't even talk about the treasurer that came 3 or 4 days later, that his father-in-law actually purchased one of the people off of the treasurer, a woman named Angela, also Angela. And so, a lot of this was happening at this time, and there were no names, and names are important. And when you don't take the time, I hear historians say, well, of course they knew slavery existed. Well, then why didn't they call them slaves in the records? And that's my argument, partly. There are a lot of other things. But my argument is, if they understood slavery, which they did, if they were familiar with the slave system, which appears they were, then why did they take 60 years almost before they started referring to anybody who was of African descent as a slave? And so we have to consider even the words that people were using and how they were recording this. And that's why I call this a very uncertain, unstable, fluid, messy time period. And to simply make reference to them as enslaved. In fact, I got so sick and tired of hearing that, I tweeted it out. Can we stop calling these black people enslaved? Because there's no record that actually says these people were slaves.
One of the primary theological justifications that was given for the enslavement of African descended people in America was a reading, or perhaps a misreading, of a scriptural passage from the Old Testament. It was the story of the patriarch Noah's descendants, and so this story was utilized to explain the racial origins of American society. And so, as the narrative reads in the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis, Noah, the patriarch, has 3 sons, and so this is just after the 40 days of this tumultuous flood. And so Noah's 3 sons are Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and they are believed through this particular body of scholarship that interprets Scripture in a particular kind of way. They're believed to represent the 3 races of American society, which is essentially African descendants who were believed to be the descendants of Ham, Euro-American descendants were believed to be the descendants of Japheth, and then Jewish or Jewish-American persons who were believed to be the descendants of Shem. And according to the narrative, it's Ham of the 3 sons, it's Ham who runs afoul of his father's honor because he views his father while he's naked and exposed in a drunken stupor. And he exposes his father's sin or his nakedness, whereas his other brothers enter into his father's tent, refusing to view their father's nakedness, and they cover his body. And so when Noah wakes up from his slumber, he realizes what his son Ham has done, and so he pronounces a curse on the descendants of Ham. And in particular, a part of that curse reads that they will be drawers of water and hewers of wood, and that they would then go on to be servants for their brethren. And so Euro-American Christians utilized this passage of Scripture to then justify the enslavement of African descended people by saying that this way of life and this arrangement of the social order was something that was not only divinely approved, but divinely sanctioned and divinely appointed. And so for enslaved Africans to demand equality, to demand liberty, to demand free access or equal access in society, not only upset the balance of American society, but it also violated the higher law or way of God. And so in these ways, Scripture became one of the principal foundations to justify the enslavement of African descended people. There's actually an example from the Georgetown narrative. So Jesuit priests at Georgetown enslaved and utilized slave labor on the Jesuit plantations throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania, but also at Georgetown College in the 19th century. There's a particular narrative that appears in the archives in reference to an enslaved woman by the name of Sucky. And so Sucky is an older enslaved woman who, as the narrative reads, learns that one of the priests has the practice of retiring into a barn to self-flagellate, right? Which means that he beats himself as a part of his spiritual discipline of purification. And so this practice went on, had been whispered amongst the slaves on this particular plantation. And so Sucky one night decides to follow the priest as he's making his way to the barn in isolation. And when she does follow him, she peeks through a crevice and she sees that he strips his robe and he begins to self-flagellate him. So she bursts in, asks him to stop, and begs him not to torture himself in this way. And there are 2 versions of the narrative. In one version of the narrative, he dismisses her until the following morning. And in the other version of the narrative, he deals with her immediately. But in both versions, her ultimate punishment is that she's called into his room later, and she, in turn, is whipped. And the justification for that is that he would ensure that she would no longer have such a high opinion of herself that she would think that she could intervene in a presumption of his wrongdoing. And in many ways, I see this narrative of the curse of Ham being replayed, right, on this plantation, thousands of years later in American society. And so I think that really demonstrates the power of narrative, the power of mythology in terms of how it shapes society. There's the biblical story, right, that justifies the physical, the cursing of the subordinate person who exposes the sin of the patriarch. And we see that same narrative playing itself out in the American context. The difference is that in the American context, the curse is borne out on the body of enslaved black people, right? I think that's one of the ways in which religion contributes to and justifies in this period of American history the enslavement, subjugation, exclusion of African descended people. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that the development of African American religion doesn't acquiesce the narrative of Christianity, right? They don't. There's a competition, there's a contestation for the right to identify one's own group as the chosen people, right? So as the bifurcation and the distinction between races becomes more concrete in American society, one of the things that emerges is that both groups, both white Americans and black Americans, both claim to be the chosen people of God, and they're utilizing the same religious narrative. They're utilizing the same story of the biblical narrative to suggest that they are the chosen people who are in relationship with God. And so what becomes central in the African American context is the story of the Exodus. Because this is a story of oppressed people who turn to the God of the Bible. And this deity intervenes, right? This deity is not impartial. This is a deity who chooses sides. And not only does the deity choose sides, the deity chooses the sides of the subjugated or oppressed people. And not just to endure suffering alongside them, but to move them, to transform them from a situation, to take them out of bondage and to move them into freedom. This becomes the central narrative of African American Christianity prior to the Civil War. So much, the ethos of freedom is so deeply embedded in African American Christianity. There's an example of a congregation, a church in Savannah, Georgia. It's one of the oldest Black Baptist churches established in the U.S. It's the First Baptist Church of Savannah. And what's interesting is that the physical edifice, the building is constructed in 1859, and in the floor, in the main sanctuary, in the physical edifice, there is a design that's drilled into the floor, and it's a cross that's encircled. And you can see this design at the end of each pew throughout the sanctuary. So I asked questions about it when I was there. And the tour guide explained that, this is a religious symbol that has meaning for multiple religious traditions. So the cross has obvious ties to Christianity. The encircled cross is a Bokongo cosmogram, which signifies traditional African religious worship. But the holes in the floor were to provide breathing space, because the subflooring of the sanctuary was where runaway slaves would be hidden, so that when slave catchers would come into the congregation and ask, "Are you housing runaways?" the church ministers and officials could feel very confident in allowing them to search the church, because they wouldn't search the subfloor. And so these holes that were drilled into the floor provided ventilation. And so what's fascinating about that story is you see multiple religious communities coming together, but the primary orientation of their worship is towards freedom, right? And so they're able to negotiate the differences that would emerge between Christian congregants, Muslim congregants, practitioners of traditional African religions, because ultimately their primary orientation is the liberation of the entire community. And so for that reason, I often talk about the Black church as being the primary institution, the primary guarantor of religious freedom in America.
You made me think about very early on, you know, for much of the 17th century, the majority of people of African descent came from the Congo, the Cameroons, the Angolan region. And they had a lot of contact with Portuguese. So you already saw a religious or syncretic religion tradition emerge where they were combining their original belief systems with Catholicism. And they were very familiar with Catholicism and with Christian law that all of the European nations had adopted. And so they were quite familiar, even in the 1620s and 30s, you see this in some of the court cases. They were familiar with freedom suits. They knew that as Christians, that they could demand their freedom, that they would be released according to Christian law and according to English law. And they knew to file those suits, which is amazing to me if you consider that while many of them coming in could also speak Portuguese, they also had to learn English. And then they were in an environment surrounded by a hostile majority that were not English people. These were native peoples, and some of them were learning their languages. So some of these people were speaking 5 or 6 different languages. I'm struggling with one. And you know, and these people were negotiating this world in which now they have another type of Christianity that they're learning about called Protestantism. And you know, while there's similarity, of course, between Protestantism and Catholicism, you had the introduction of these Puritans, who were sort of the uber, you know, they were the Calvinists. Yes, you know, and so we're not talking Church of England here. We're talking, you know, people who came in with a sternness, but they also came with the language justifying slavery. Mather, Cotton, and then Cotton Mather, you know, years later. All of these people were actually coming with written justifications for enslavement of people of African descent, which is why Massachusetts passed a law in 1641, 1641, 20 years before Virginia did, to enslave people of African descent, because their belief system was tangled up with their religious ideas. And at the same time, you had Africans seeing religion as the vehicle for freedom and using that as a way to define freedom, while many of the Europeans were using religion as a way to define bondage.
How about the language of rights and liberties?
In Philadelphia, right outside of Constitution Hall, that's where you had the big park, where everyone was on their soapbox giving speeches. And that was a big gathering place for many African Americans by that time who were talking, who were listening and hearing and talking about these ideas of liberty and freedom and civil liberties, as well as rights and privileges. And this was scary to the founding fathers. And that's why some historians have argued, that's why they moved the capital out of Philadelphia away from this language, because they were afraid that freedom and liberty and their definition of it would actually apply to the other.
African American people are fully attentive to all the language and all the meanings of the language and are ready to use that when it's said. So I think one thing that people, Virginia is hard to imagine in a way, because we know those scenes, right? And we know the scenes of the early 17th century Jamestown, and flash forward over kind of blurred kind of area to the time of the Revolution, you're saying. And then the cotton gin. It's the story of slavery seems suddenly to shift to the west and to the south. Let's see if we can imagine together what was slavery like in the early 19th century, especially here in Richmond. What would you see?
Well, I just want to mention this man named David Walker, who's a free black from North Carolina, who published a book in 1829 called David Walker's Appeal. And in this book, he had actually gone down to Charleston, South Carolina, lived there for a little while, and then went to Boston, and found out that freedom was not what was promised in Boston. That there that freedom was really, it also included civil liberties. And it included freedom from oppression and from discrimination. And he found that to be much more severe in Boston than it was in North Carolina or in Charleston, ironically. And he wrote this book and used not only the Declaration of Independence, but he set it up like the Constitution. And he talked about blacks and whites. Essentially, to blacks, he said, you're born a full human being, and you have every right to demand and claim your freedom. And if someone tries to stop them, kill them. And then he turned to white people, and he used this term that, is a real biblical term. He said, woe be it unto you. I mean, he actually said that, if you try to stop us from being free. Whoa. And he said, you are being a hypocrite. You're violating your own precepts, your own belief system. And by doing so, you will bring damnation on yourself and your children, because we will fight for our freedom, our God-given freedom. And he said, if you fight against us, we will hate you as much as we want to love you right now if you give us our freedom. But if you don't, we will hate you, and it will be destruction for you. And this scared the heck out of American society. They put a bounty on his head, dead or alive. And unfortunately, a short while after the book was published, he died of meningitis. His daughter had contracted that and died, and he died a short time afterwards. And of course, the rumor mill started that he was assassinated, because it was too close to all the circumstances. So, just telling that quick story, you're seeing the same threads here in Richmond as well as throughout Virginia, that people were quite aware. And you think about 2 years later, the Nat Turner revolt, where Nat Turner...
wrote that Alphonso over here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this really quick. He was a man who his followers only attacked and killed slaveholders.
So, talking about this intertwinement of the language of the Bible and the Bible, the language of freedom, Nat Turner does that.
Absolutely. In many ways, I think Turner's confession, so to sort of paint the scene, Turner gives his confession after he's been captured. So when Turner's relating, according to the printed confession, the written confession that survives in history, the interview begins by Turner saying, sir, you've asked me to give a reason to explain the motivations behind the late insurrection, as you call it. And from that point, Turner then begins to tell his life story. And as Turner is narrating his own autobiography, he does so in a way that he's utilizing narrative elements from the biblical story of Exodus, but he's applying them to his own autobiographical context, so that his life reads as though he's a liberator. He's the Moses character. In many ways, I believe that there's no documentary evidence to suggest this, but some historians have speculated that it's possible that Turner is even inspired by David Walker's appeal. Right now, we can't verify that he had access to actually read it, but we do know that we can't prove that he didn't, because the appeal circulated very, very widely. But one of the things that is interesting about how Turner is appropriating some of the symbolic and thematic elements of Exodus to his own autobiographical context is the vision that inspires, right, the rebellion. He says that he sees, like these vision signs, right, in the heavens, droplets of blood that begin to appear on various, they start to manifest on the corn and in the fields and in various places. But what crystallizes it for him is the voice of the Spirit, right, who's telling him that this is the path to bringing about the kingdom of God. And so Turner's whole understanding of biblical mythology is wrapped up in this narrative of struggle between oppressor and oppressed, between the enslaved and the enslaver. That does two things that I think are significant. On the one hand, I think it demonstrates the kind of brilliant theological imagination, right, that exists within the enslaved community. But on the other hand, it shows that for African Americans, the question of enslavement, the questions about rights, about equality, were not just political questions. They elevated these concerns to the level of theology. So from early on, these were the questions of utmost importance. These were the questions that were at the center of not only how they would exist in American society, but how they saw themselves in relationship to deities, to God.
When you look at Nat Turner's revolt, you know, it happened in 1831, and this was the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. And if you're talking about the impact of the Second Great Awakening, a lot of white abolitionists were inspired by the Second Great Awakening. You saw all these reform movements in society inspired, and one of the things that the Second Great Awakening was all about was taking action. That your actions as a Christian were just as important as your words and your prayers. And if you weren't willing to stand up for what you believed in, there was such an evangelical tone to that. And so everything that Nat Turner was expressing was in line with what was happening in society, which is the emergence of the Second Great Awakening that was all about real freedom, real liberty, and freedom from silence, from the silence that allows people to flourish.
And so after Nat Turner's rebellion, right here in the city, there's the last public debate about what the future of slavery might be in Virginia. And people are saying remarkable things like it's terrible for white people, it's a curse upon our state, we should get rid of it. But they don't. They say it's inexpedient at this time to take action. And after that, there's the next 30 years, no public debate over slavery. So you think about how we go in the beginning, all this inchoate thing that people try to define, until the last 30 years of the slave South, it seems to be kind of hermetically sealed, right? White people do all their own satisfaction have resolved these kinds of issues, right? I guess I like, and what people tend to forget is that Virginia is the largest slave state at the time of the Civil War. 500,000 people in bondage were here. And so today, people are, oh, Virginia's really the mid-Atlantic, whatever. Well, it's not only the place where slavery is hammered out in North America, but it's a place where, in many ways, your family would be at greatest risk of being broken apart by sin. Any day your children be sold away. So, before we take a break, sort of in this part of this, before we come back and have a discussion, is it your belief that white Virginians actually have come to peace with themselves in this last 30 years of the slave South? Do you think they've been able to turn the founding documents and the founding document of the Bible? Are they guilt-free? Do they believe this? Or do you think that there is an acknowledgement that they're denying the fundamental humanity of people?
I think that there is a historical annihilation of the truth in what happened during that time period, because you had Congress in 1836 pass a gag order saying if you bring up the issue of slavery on the floor of Congress, you're going to be ousted. So I think that hermetic sealing was artificial because it's starting in the 1830s throughout to the end of the Civil War that you see the emergence of what we call the Underground Railroad. And you're talking about some serious rancor going on, not only within the white community, but within the nation as a whole. And you're seeing such tremendous fear. The thing that Virginia feared the most was white people cooperating with the escape of enslaved people. And they were so afraid, they kept passing all kinds of laws and even passing laws that would allow for people to get paid if you identified, and of course that person was convicted for helping an enslaved person escape. And the highest amount you could be awarded is if you identified a white person because they were seen as undermining society.
I think what strikes me is, as Cassandra, you mentioned, the fledgling Underground Railroad that's coterminous with the Second Great Awakening, which is also coterminous with the fledgling abolitionism. So in America, the abolitionist movement really begins to gain ground in the 1830s and in the 1840s. One of the results of that is this explosion in literature that's produced by African Americans, right? What we would call, in terms of the genre, the slave narratives. And one in particular, I think, I would like to highlight. So James Pennington was an enslaved man in Maryland, so just north of Virginia. In the preface of his narrative, one of the things that he writes is that the whole of the system, the whole of the institution, is encapsulated in the chattel principle. And he says more so than the cart whip, more so than the plantation, more so than all of these individual features that we utilize, that we think of when we imagine or conjure images of slavery. No, the real heart of the matter exists in the chattel principle, this understanding that again predates the founding of the nation and also predates the codification of the system into law, right? This belief that organizes society and allows us to think that it is okay to consider human beings as property. I think that this, Pennington identifies this as the animating principle of the entire system. And so to just back up historically just a few months, at the latter part of the 18th century, the tobacco crop begins to fail. And in 1808, the U.S. government outlaws the transatlantic slave trade, which causes now an explosion of the domestic slave trade. And so one of the things that Pennington wants to pinpoint in his narrative is he wants to debunk the idea that slavery in states like Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky are a milder form of slavery, or that people enslaved in these geographies experience less harsh treatment because they have Christian masters. He really wants to debunk this idea because he says, in place of physical violence, right, in place of the harsh labor that people experience on tobacco plantations, there is now the fear of being sold south, the fear of one's family being separated, and then also the unknown, right, that happens as enslaved people are being sold to sugar and cotton producing states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, right? So there is this sort of fear that creates a new sense of terror that, that replaces, or that I think goes right alongside the sort of the tensions around being punished violently. And so there's a new kind of psychological violence that accompanies the physical violence that enslaved people have grown accustomed to. And I think that what allows that to continue to permeate American society is this idea that African descended people are not fully to be included in this new democratic project that we are creating. And I don't know that in American society we've ever quite fully come to terms with that.